Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me on this week's video cast. Today we're looking at Strayer's Chapter 4, Culture and Religion in Eurasia and North Africa. In the opening section, he begins by describing Confucius's 2560th birthday celebration in China. This is a concrete example of the enduring legacy of the philosophies, traditions, and religions that grow out of the classical era. He then moves to an overview of the classical cultures and religions that he's going to talk about, and then he raises the question, why did these traditions emerge at about the same time? A likely answer to that question is it's a response to the increasing complexity of second-wave civilizations and empires that more and more are removing us from sort of the traditional roots that had been established over time. Another way of thinking about it is that these are new solutions to age-old problems that have been at the center of human experience throughout all of time. Questions like, what is the purpose of life? How should humans live? And what happens when we die? And so they're trying to develop new ways to address those issues. The solutions to these problems then in turn become different traditions that serve as the backbone throughout all of not just the classical civilizations, but civilization thereafter. Strayer begins with China, and after the fall of the Zhou dynasty, China was mired in the Warring States period for nearly 2 centuries. Their culture and society were in total disarray. Consequently, thinkers began to address the question of how to create order out of all of this chaos. Their answers, however, are not necessarily religious. This is a distinction we will make in class over the next 2 weeks. One answer to the question of how to create order out of chaos was advanced by a philosopher named Han Fei-Tzu, who started a system called legalism. Advocates of legalism believed that humans were self-serving and short-sighted. Thus, to get them to do good, they had to be sure of high rewards, and to keep them from doing bad, they had to fear heavy punishment. So a strict legal code was the key to this belief. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, used legalism to create social order out of the chaos of the Warring States period. His brutal reign discredited legalism, however, in the eyes of many, and while the idea of a strong central authority continued after his reign, legalism would be replaced by other systems. Another answer to the question of creating order out of chaos was advanced by Confucius, known in the West as Confucius. Confucius came from an aristocratic family in northern China, and he believed he had found the way to create social harmony. While he sought office where he could put his ideas into effect, he never found such a job and remained a thinker and a teacher. After his death, his students collected his teachings into a short book called the Analects, and later scholars created a body of thought that came to be called Confucianism. In clear contrast to legalism, Confucianism taught that the strong moral example of social superiors should teach others how to behave. And therefore, the goal of Confucianism is teaching people to be strong moral examples. Confucius taught that human beings are defined by hierarchical social relationships. By observing your place in these relationships, he believed, humans can learn to develop Ren, a difficult-to-translate concept that means something like benevolence, human-heartedness, or goodness. The Han Dynasty rejected the Qin use of legalism and used Confucianism as a governing philosophy for the new state bureaucracy. Since government service required an entry test, Confucianism came to dominate the educational system and became central to the worldview of civil servants, those who were actually running the government. Because civil servants were supposed to be the embodiment of social morality, they enjoyed an esteemed social status, while merchants and soldiers were much lower in the social hierarchy. Confucianism stressed filial piety, which is loyalty to and reverence of one's parents and ancestors. This loyalty was important in and of itself, but also as a model for loyalty to the emperor. Confucian views of the family were rigidly hierarchical and patriarchic. Female subordination was justified by the belief that the superior world of the heavens was male and the inferior material world of the earth was female. While Confucius was not an atheist and did not deny the effect of religion, his philosophy was based on teachings that focused on establishing social harmony in the material world, not religious or other spiritual worlds. This is what we call secularism. A third answer to the question of how to create order came from a contemporary of Confucius, a man who withdrew from society completely to live as a hermit, Lao Tzu. As a young man, Lao Tzu was interested in scholarship and worldly success, but after he wrote a short poetic work known as the Tao Te Ching or Tao Te Ching, he withdrew into China's Wild West. His text is quite mysterious and enigmatic, more poetic than philosophical. Nonetheless, it became the key text for Taoism, or sometimes called Taoism. In sharp contrast to Confucian emphasis on social engagement, Lao Tzu taught that people are most human when they leave society and enter nature, appreciating its mysteries, beauty, and truth. Also in sharp contrast to Confucian teachings, Lao Tzu did not value education, but encouraged people to behave in a spontaneous and natural manner. Learning to trust one's instinct was central to his teachings. Lao Tzu spoke of a mysterious force of truth and goodness that surrounded all things. If one could understand this indefinable force, one could live a good life. The easiest method to found this Tao, or way, was to follow the examples found in the natural world. While we might see many obvious contradictions between Confucianism and Taoism, Chinese elites saw them as a natural complement to each other. Many civil servants might have used ideas of social hierarchy to govern during the day and then withdraw into nature, art, and poetry in the evenings. Like China, India has had periods of political turmoil in its history. Unlike China, though, Indian culture has always been intensely interested in questions of spirituality. From the time of the Indus Valley civilization through the introduction of the Aryans, the spirituality has served to unify otherwise diverse and fragmented peoples. The earliest forms of formal religion in South Asia were introduced by the Aryans. They brought with them a tradition that had no individual founder, and they allowed for a great deal of variation in pursuit of social harmony. These variations have led some scholars to use the term Hinduism, plural, as opposed to Hinduism. The Vedas are the earliest Indian texts, and they were initially passed down by Brahmins with an I, who were the priests of this early form of religion, sometimes called Vedism. These originally oral texts that were later written down illustrate the importance of social hierarchy and religious ritual to the Aryans, and they would later become the foundation for what we call Hinduism. As lower classes began to react increasingly negatively to the elite's emphasis on social status and ritual obligation, a body of Hindu texts called the Upanishads, written by various anonymous authors, arose that focused more on mystical and philosophical issues than on formal rituals. The Upanishads taught that an individual human soul, or an Atman, was part of a greater world soul, or Brahman, with an A, Brahman. The eternal unity of Brahman was the true reality, and the divisions and diversities of the material world were a mere illusion. Hinduism believes that human souls are trapped in a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth known as samsara, what we in the West call reincarnation. One's status in this life is governed by the consequences of the actions in a previous life, or karma. Only those who could rise above the illusions of the material world could break free of the cycles of samsara, thus achieving moksha, which is the release from the material world and unity with the divine great soul of Brahman. It is worth knowing that in Hindu belief, though, this could take thousands of years over many, many lifetimes. The social implications of this worldview endorsed caste distinctions and hierarchy, as well as patriarchy. Women came to be seen as unclean and dirty, and thus inferior to men. The laws of Manu institutionalized these inequalities and promoted young girls to marrying older men, wives being obedient to their husbands, and widows never remarrying. Hinduism, as the many diverse traditions of South Asia came to be known, recognized that there were many paths to the divine, with a huge number of gods and goddesses of widely different character and temperament. Various devotional cults developed. Often they would draw women or lower-class men who felt left out of the practices that emphasized rituals and social hierarchy. These different paths of Hinduism were not the only spiritual traditions to develop in India, however. Indeed, while Buddhism would grow out of these Hindu paths, it would also challenge some of their fundamental beliefs. Buddhism, unlike the collection of traditions we call Hinduism, has a historical founding figure. Siddhartha Gautama was a North Indian prince who lived a life of opulence until he encountered examples of sickness, old age, and death. He then went on a spiritual quest until achieving enlightenment at age 35. He spent the remainder of his life teaching his message. The Buddha's central teaching was that life is suffering, and that suffering could be ended by ending desire. The enlightened state, or nirvana, could be achieved by following the Buddha's path, at which point one's individual identity would fuse with the larger whole, and all individual desires and delusions would vanish. In other words, one can experience an escape from samsara in one's own lifetime. This was a pretty radical break from Hinduism, and so many communities of monks formed to follow his teachings. Buddhism stemmed from Hinduism and shared many key concepts, such as the illusion of the material world, samsara, and karma. Indeed, the end goal of release from individual identity and fusion with the large world soul is shared by both faiths. While both practiced meditation, Buddhism was much less tied and even hostile to rituals and caste. Initially, the Buddha did not allow women into the community of monks. However, after some pressure, he allowed them to establish communities for nuns, but they were clearly subordinate to male monks. Nonetheless, many women found more opportunities for spiritual fulfillment than in male-dominated Hindu communities. Eschewing the Hinduism elite language of Sanskrit for the popularly used language of Pali, Buddhist teachings were accessible to the less educated social classes. The rejection of the caste system, the establishment of stupas and shrines as sacred sites to visit, and the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka's promotion of the faith all helped to win many converts and establish the faith as distinct from Hinduism. The original branch of Buddhism, Theravada, which translates as the teaching of the elders, focused on wisdom passed down through the monks. While not denying their existence, they talked little of gods. The Buddha was not portrayed as a god in Theravada. Soon after, another branch of Buddhism, which is known as Mahayana, or the Greater Vehicle, began to take on aspects of the supernatural. The Buddha became a godlike figure, and there were believed to be numerous bodhisattvas who had achieved enlightenment but stayed in the material world to help others achieve enlightenment. These bodhisattvas became the subject of popular veneration. As Hinduism began to gain in popularity, especially Mahayana Buddhism outside of South Asia, Hinduism began to develop in ways that appealed to common people as a response. Again, the openness of Hinduism to a variety of spiritual experiences allowed it to adapt. One adaptation involved collecting oral traditions and writing epic stories of battle and humans interacting with deities that were wildly entertaining and so incredibly popular. More importantly, though, they provided a popular communication of Hindu teachings to the masses. The longest epic poem ever composed in any language is the Mahabharata, a story of a great war between two branches of family from which all Indians are said to descend. In the middle of it, there occurs a very long passage, long enough to become its own separate book, known as the Bhagavad Gita, in which the greatest warrior Arjuna has a discussion with his charioteer, Lord Krishna, about fulfilling one's dharma or duty. Krishna, it turns out, is an incarnation of the god Vishnu, and the Bhagavad Gita is considered by many Hindus as the most holy of books. The Ramayana is a more traditional epic. Its hero, Rama, goes on a quest to fulfill his dharma, overcoming many painful obstacles in the process. Rama is also an incarnation of the god Vishnu. This popular story, which is popular throughout all of Asia, gives common people the example of following one's moral obligations in the world as a path toward fulfilling one's spiritual duty. Strayer glosses over the concept of dharma, but we will examine it as well as the distinction between reincarnation and incarnation in class. And by the way, it wouldn't hurt my feelings if someone were to ask me about that distinction at the appropriate time. The word bhakti means worship. This movement within Hinduism involved intense and passionate songs, prayers, and rituals towards gods such as Vishnu and Shiva. Often this form of expression was open to all, regardless of caste or gender. Indeed, the greatest bhakti poet of all time is a woman named Mirabai. Buddhism waned in India as it faced competition from Islam and some concern about the wealth of monasteries, but mostly because Hinduism is a tolerant faith that could incorporate and absorb Buddhism. Over time, the Buddha came to be viewed as the ninth incarnation of Vishnu, and veneration of the Buddha became similar to veneration of other deities. While South Asia continued the Indo-European tradition of polytheism in the form of Hinduism, the Middle East went down a different path, from polytheism to dualism to monotheism. Please note that my interpretation of this development is a bit different than Strayer's, and so I will present a slightly different account in class. I will argue that Zoroastrianism is really a twist on the early polytheism of the Indo-European peoples who moved into Iran shortly before the Aryans moved into South Asia. Their language, known as Avestan, is closely related to Sanskrit. It would eventually develop into Persian and then into modern Farsi. While it is uncertain when Zarathustra lived, his ideas did not take hold until well after his death, we know for sure. He sought to stop violence and cattle raiding amongst the Persians by declaring a single unique God that was the source of all light, wisdom, and goodness in the name of Ahura Mazda. Zarathustra taught that there was a constant struggle between the forces of good, Ahura Mazda and his forces, and evil, Angra Mainyu and his forces. At some point, he taught, a savior would come to help the forces of good defeat evil, and there would be a final judgment for all men with either punishment or a reward in the afterlife. The Achaemenid dynasty gave Zoroastrianism and its priesthood state support, thus allowing it to spread throughout most of Southwest Asia. It never spread much outside of the empire, though, and it was seriously damaged after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Despite an attempt to rekindle the flame of Zoroastrianism during the Parthian and Sasanian dynasties of Persia, the spread of Islam in the post-classical era effectively wiped the religion out. Today there is only a few who practice the faith after fleeing to India, where they are known as Parsis or Persians. While Zoroastrianism's practitioners are now few, its lasting effects are many. Ideas like human free will, the struggle of good versus evil, a savior, and judgment day influenced the Jewish community that lived in the Persian Empire. Moreover, the Zoroastrian idea of heaven and hell would directly impact Christianity and later Islam. In contrast to Zoroastrianism, which grew out of Indo-European polytheism and later prospered in a powerful empire, Judaism was the tribal faith of a very small Semitic community that was constantly forced to move and experienced only a few short-lived kingdoms. Nonetheless, its influence would be felt well into the future. Rather than state identity holding the Hebrew people together, it was a shared cultural identity that survived the centuries-long migrations from Mesopotamia to Egypt, onto the promised land of Canaan, before suffering invasion and exile at the hands of the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and later the Romans. Wherever they went, though, the Hebrews maintained this unique cultural identity. The first of the laws passed down to the Hebrews was that there would be no other gods but God. In Hebrew, the word for God is Yahweh. This was extremely difficult to manage in the polytheistic agrarian world of the ancient Middle East, and many Hebrews continued to practice polytheism. However, over time, the pro-monotheistic priests won out. The Jews' relationship with God was contractual. So long as they kept their faith and obeyed him, they would be rewarded with a growing population and prosperity. For many, the link to Yahweh was personal. He was a God that one could appeal to rather than an abstract force. This religious development laid the foundation for Christianity and Islam. While Greek mythology has its roots in the same Indo-European polytheism as India and Persia, it developed a cultural tradition that was not based on faith. Greek tradition held that the world is governed by natural laws that can be understood by human reason. In this regard, it's more like China than not. This faith in reason, or rationalism, flourished during the classical era at about the same time the polis system flourished in Greece. Specifically, though, the greatest contributions came from Athenians during the age of Pericles. The Greek contribution lay in asking a series of analytic questions about a wide variety of issues rather than proclaiming authoritative answers. This is best illustrated in the example of Socrates. His constant questioning of authority led to his being accused of corrupting the youth and then to a death sentence. Even so, his Socratic method is the basis for many intellectual endeavors to this day. Those of you who are now or will later take Mr. Baker will become quite familiar with the Socratic seminar. Socrates was the teacher for a student named Plato, who would go on to become a great philosopher in his own right. Plato in turn taught Aristotle, perhaps the most precise example of the Greek way of knowing. Aristotle, as I mentioned in class, was the teacher for Alexander. Each of these philosophers provided important contributions to Greek thought in regards to questioning assumptions, defining terms and systems, and cataloging types of evidence. Central to the Greek philosophical contribution was the use of observation and reason to make sense of a complicated world. Their questions, analysis, and answers did not rely on religion, leaps of faith, or great mysteries. Rather, the world was knowable, and reason was the way to know it. Even as the myths and ritual of old continued in Greece, the legacy of Greek rationalism spread throughout the world. Greek thought was preserved in the Academy in Athens, which was initially funded by Plato himself. It was spread by Alexander and Hellenization during his dramatic imperial expansion, and it was embraced by many Romans as their empire united most of the Mediterranean world. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, and with the hostility toward all things pagan displayed by the medieval Christian church thereafter, Europe turned its back on Greek learning, only to rediscover and embrace it many years later. This rediscovery would contribute to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution in the late agrarian, early modern era. So if early Christian Europe rejected Greek learning as pagan, where did it survive? In the cities, libraries, and centers of learning in the Islamic world. Here, Muslim scholars studied, critiqued, and built upon Greek, Indian, Persian, and other international scholarship. Only when medieval Europe engaged with the Muslim world during the Crusades in the post-classical era was this wisdom brought back into Europe. While the Romans were clearly influenced by Greek rationalism, in the end it would become a Christian empire. Despite the fact that Christians were initially persecuted by Rome, it would spread throughout the world. This universal appeal invites meaningful comparison with Buddhism. Both Christianity and Buddhism were founded by historical individuals, and both of them grew out of earlier anonymous traditions, namely Judaism and Hinduism. While Jesus and Siddhartha came from very different social backgrounds, they both had a similar and profound encounter with a higher level of reality. These intensely personal experiences became the basis for their teachings. Both Jesus and Siddhartha taught a message of wisdom in which compassion and love, even for one's enemies, are at the center of a path toward personal transformation that would challenge conventional values. In this way, they would give hope to many people who experience great suffering. Despite the similarities, their differences reflect both their individual social backgrounds and the traditions from which they emerged. While they both challenged the social order, Jesus' message was so threatening to Rome that he was crucified after only a short time teaching. Siddhartha, on the other hand, would continue to teach for decades before dying at the age of 80. While both Siddhartha and Jesus wanted to reform their native traditions, their followers had other ideas. After their deaths, their elevated status, Jesus as Christ and Siddhartha as Buddha, quickly became the basis for brand new religions. How exactly did the teachings of an obscure rabbi in the Middle East become one of the major religions in world history? Better call Saul. After hearing the teachings of Jesus, he was baptized and took the name Paul. A Roman citizen, he was able to travel freely, spreading the good news to both Jews and Gentiles. He sent out envoys, established churches, and oversaw the rules of this new community of believers. Consequently, he was the central figure in the spread of the early Christian faith and would later be named St. Paul. While Paul and other church leaders were openly hostile to women, both at home and in the church, the new faith nonetheless provided new opportunities for many women in the Roman Empire. Moreover, Jesus' social message attracted many converts from the lower social classes. While in the modern era Christianity became synonymous with Europe, in its first few centuries the faith was strongest in Southwest Asia and North Africa, with churches, monasteries, and other institutions spread through the Roman infrastructure of cities and roads and beyond into neighboring lands. While the Roman state was initially suspicious of and hostile to the faith's monotheism, which was seen as a form of atheism in its denial of Roman gods and the divinity of the emperor, once Emperor Constantine converted in the early 4th century, the faith soon became a state religion used to forge unity in a diverse empire. So how does the spread of Christianity compare and contrast with the spread of Buddhism? When the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism, the faith did reach more people. However, Ashoka's tolerance towards all religions is in contrast to the strict enforcement of Christianity as the state religion in Rome shortly after the conversion of Constantine. Another difference is that Hinduism would incorporate Buddha into its own faith, and then experience a revival of duty and devotion that would essentially eliminate Buddhism in India. In Rome, however, there was never a revival of the pre-Christian polytheistic belief system. Despite losing ground in India, Buddhism did not die out. Instead, it spread eastward and created connections with South Asia to most of East and Southeast Asia. Similarly, Christianity created connections throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This is a map from your textbook, and you will see Buddhism growing up in northern India spreads north and south, does not remain in India proper very long, but it does move into Central Asia, eventually into China, Korea, Japan later on, and into Southeast Asia. But that link with South Asia creates a kind of network in this region of the world. Christianity, which is born in the Levant, spreads via the Roman Empire into the Mediterranean and eventually into Europe. It also spreads into East Africa. And as these two religions begin to grow, more and more questions arose about how to organize the faith into institutions. The answers to some of these questions sparked controversy and led to certain divisions. While in its first few generations, Christianity provided many opportunities for women to assume positions of leadership, by the 5th century they were being systematically excluded. The faith was beset by numerous debates about the teachings and nature of Jesus, as well as which texts to include as part of the faith and its practice. A series of church councils sought to establish an orthodoxy in regards to its teachings, texts, and rituals. Those who did not adhere to what the councils proclaimed would be expelled from the community of Christians. The Roman Empire was characterized by a distinct linguistic and cultural divide after the split by Diocletian between the Latin West and the Greek East. This divide influenced the interpretation and practice of the Christian faith, creating a profound distinction that will become important in the post-classical era, but that indeed survives until today. Buddhism also experienced a diversity of traditions and a series of councils that failed to impose unity upon the faith and its practitioners. It's also remarkable to note that in the Buddhist traditions there is a relative lack of hierarchical structure, especially when compared to Christianity. In the reflections section, Strayer raises some very important questions about the relationship between religion and history. For example, how are historians who use a social scientific method of analysis based on evidence supposed to deal with the mysteries of faith? How can a historian assess one's claim to have encountered God? What if historical research shows that the faiths have changed over time and may be quite unlike what they were decades or centuries ago? If historians give an account of various sides in a religious conflict, do they risk entering the debate themselves? Despite all of these challenges, one thing seems clear. Religion is central to the story of humanity. We must at least try to understand world religions if we are to understand world history. Thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.